41 degrees above zero. That was the temperature in Huron, Dakota Territory on the morning of January 12th, 1888. Children walked to school without their coats. A farmer outside of Kingsbury County left his barn door open. A woman doing laundry in the yard of a claim shanty on the eastern edge of town hung her washing on the line without her mittens, and the frozen ground had gone soft under her feet for the first time in weeks. Nobody saw it coming until it was already there. By early afternoon, a wall of dark cloud had rolled in from the northwest, not slowly, the way normal storms moved, but fast, like something falling. The air temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. People reported that their breath stopped catching, that their skin registered the change before their minds did, and then the wind hit at 60 miles an hour, snow not falling but flying sideways. Ice, crystals, so fine. They sealed eyelids shut and clogged nostrils in seconds. The sky going the color of pewter and then going blank. By nightfall, 235 people were dead schoolchildren frozen in their seats. Farmers found face down in their own yards 10 feet from the farmhouse door. The temperature outside plunged to minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit in Huron, and out at Poplar River, Montana, it went to minus 56.8 degrees Fahrenheit by January 15th. Now here is what most people don't know about that storm. On the far edge of Kingsbury County, one cabin sat through all 18 hours of the children's blizzard, that's what they'd later call it, and at no point did the temperature inside drop below 58 degrees. The fire burned steadily through the night on less than a quarter of a cord of wood. 2 neighbors showed up on the doorstep sometime around 3 in the morning, half frozen, having walked 1.5 miles through that storm to reach it. They weren't surprised when she opened the door. They knew exactly which cabin to walk toward in a blizzard. They'd been watching her work on it since October. Her name was Ingrid Solberg. She was 26 years old, a widow, Norwegian born, arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1885 on the Burlington Railroad with her husband Carl. Carl had come to work and to claim land. Ingrid had come because Carl had, and because there was nothing left for her in Trondheim, her father dead, her mother remarried to a man who made the house feel smaller every year, and $2 in her coat pocket that she'd been carrying since she was 17. Carl died in September of 1887, a fever that moved into his lungs and never moved out. He was dead in 11 days, and Ingrid was left with a 160-acre claim on the Kingsbury County grasslands, a log cabin that Carl and a neighbor had raised in 2 days the previous spring, 6 laying hens, 1 draft horse named Björn, and a woodpile that even she could see was not going to last past February. The cabin was what the claim required: 4 walls, a stove, a door, a window. Carl had notched the cottonwood logs himself, and the corners were tight enough. But the chinking, the filling between the logs that kept outside air outside, had been done the way men did things in a hurry. Dried prairie grass stuffed in the gaps by hand, some sections packed with old rags. One stretch along the north wall sealed with nothing more than a piece of canvas tacked with nails. Ingrid knew what that meant. She'd spent 1 winter in that cabin already, and knew exactly what it meant when the temperature went below zero, and the wind came from the northwest at 30 miles an hour. The stove would eat wood at a rate she couldn't sustain. The drafts would chase her from one side of the room to the other. The floor joints would seep cold air up around her feet, no matter where she stood. She'd spent that first Dakota winter in 4 layers of wool, burning wood they couldn't afford, watching the candle flame bend sideways on windless nights because the air was moving through the walls. So 3 weeks after Carl was in the ground, Ingrid Solberg walked down to the creek at the edge of her claim, a tributary of the Kingsbury drainage that ran along the eastern boundary, and she started pulling clay out of the bank. There was good clay in that creek bed. She'd noticed it the previous spring when the bank had slumped after the snowmelt and exposed a grey-blue layer 6 inches below the topsoil. It had the right feel to it, heavy, plastic when wet, the way riverbank clay gets when it's been sitting under constant moisture. She'd filed that away the way people file things when they have no immediate use for them but sense that they will, and in October of 1887 the use arrived. She cut buckets of clay from the bank with a flat shovel Carl had left in the lean-to, 12 inches wide at the blade. She mixed the clay with coarse sand from the creek bottom, roughly 2 parts clay to 1 part sand, and packed in chopped prairie grass she'd cut with the scythe, 3-inch lengths, to give the mixture tensile strength. For the fireplace surround and the section around the stovepipe, she added more sand, knowing the clay near heat would expand and contract with every fire and needed the extra aggregate to keep from cracking. She went at the north wall first, where the canvas was. She pulled the canvas out and started forcing the clay mixture into the gap with her hands, working it back as deep as she could reach, getting it behind the log faces so it would key into the irregularities of the wood rather than just sitting on the surface. Over that first layer she packed split willow sticks close to finger width, stripped of bark, then another layer of the clay mixture over the sticks, pressing it flush with the log faces on both sides, inside and out. The town had a name for what she was doing. They called it mudding up, and a couple of the men standing outside Engstrom's General Store on Main Street used that phrase when the subject came up in late October, which it did, because word had gotten around that the Norwegian widow was spending her days at the creek in near-freezing temperatures digging clay, instead of doing any of the things a widow in her situation was supposed to be doing, figuring out how to get back east, or find a second husband, or at minimum appeal to the county for winter relief. One of those men was a rancher named Carl Halverson. He'd been in Dakota Territory since 1881, he'd survived 4 winters, and he had a log cabin on the western edge of Kingsbury County, with walls he described as good and tight. He heard about Ingrid Solberg's clay project and rode out to see it one afternoon in late October because he had decided that someone ought to tell her she was wasting her time. He looked at the north wall, at the river clay she'd packed 2 to 3 inches deep across the gap, at the willow sticks visible in the middle, at the smooth troweled outer face she'd done with her hands and a flat piece of cottonwood bark. He looked at the bucket of clay mix she'd carried up from the creek that morning, still sitting next to the wall with the grass fibre floating at the edges, and he shook his head and told her that one good freeze-thaw cycle would pop the clay right out, that prairie grass wasn't worth a damn as a binder, and that she was putting a winter's worth of work into something that would need to be done again come April. He wasn't entirely wrong. He was right that plain clay cracks, and right that freeze-thaw cycles are the enemy of earthen chinking. What he didn't know was what Ingrid had added to the mix. She thanked him for his advice and went back inside. Here is what Carl Halverson didn't understand, and what most settlers on the northern plains learned only by watching their chinking fail. The thing that keeps a clay-lime mixture from cracking in a Dakota winter is not the clay, because the clay is the filler, and what holds the clay is lime. Ingrid had brought lime with her, not much, a 20-pound sack of hydrated lime she'd purchased at Engstrom's in September, the week after Carl's burial. When she was going through his account book and figuring out what she actually needed to survive and what she could do without, most settlers used the lime for whitewashing interior walls or treating ailments. Ingrid used it in her chinking mix. 1 part lime to 4 parts of the clay-sand mixture, worked in while the clay was still wet. What hydrated lime does inside a clay chinking joint is slow chemistry. As the mix dries, the lime reacts with water and carbon dioxide in the air, converting back to calcium carbonate, the same compound as limestone. That conversion takes months, but while it's happening, it binds the clay particles together and fills hairline cracks as they form, because the carbonation process produces a slight expansion. The joint doesn't become rigid, it stays slightly flexible, but it doesn't pop out in the spring. German-Russian immigrants who'd been building with earthen materials on the Russian steppe for generations knew this. Ingrid had grown up watching her grandfather plaster the interior of a stone farmhouse the same way. She'd carried the knowledge across the Atlantic without thinking of it as knowledge, the way people carry things that come from watching rather than being taught. The lime also changed how the exterior surface behaved once the chinking dried. When she ran a coat of lime wash over the outer face, the surface shed water rather than absorbing it, and water is the thing that destroys clay. Chinking from the outside rain drives into a joint. The clay swells, dries, shrinks, cracks, and a lime-washed surface slows that cycle significantly. By the second week of November, she had the north wall done, inside and out, then the west wall, then the south. She did the east wall last because it faced away from the prevailing wind and was the least urgent. It took her 6 weeks in total. Every morning she was at the creek pulling clay while Björn watched from the paddock. Every afternoon she was on her knees at the wall face, or standing on an overturned crate to reach the upper courses of logs, pressing clay into gaps, smoothing the outer face with her palm. Her hands were cracked by mid-October, and by November bled at the knuckles when she opened her fists wide. She also did the floor. There were gaps between the board floor and the base log wide enough in some places to see the frozen ground below, and she filled those from underneath with clay-packed rags, then sealed the inside seam with a thin skim coat of clay mortar. She ran along the base of every wall. Then she turned to the stovepipe. The stovepipe collar, where the metal pipe passed through the roof, was almost always the worst heat loss point in a frontier cabin, and it was also the most dangerous. A loose collar meant a direct draft path that ran from the roof opening down to the stove, and while the stove was burning, that draft was going in the right direction, but when the fire died and the stovepipe cooled, the draft reversed, cold air pooling at the pipe collar, sinking into the room, and concentrating at floor level where sleeping settlers were most likely to be. But the collar was only part of the problem. Every wood stove burning on a plain required enormous amounts of air for combustion, roughly 600 cubic feet of air per pound of wood burned, and that air had to come from somewhere. If it came from inside the cabin, the stove created negative pressure, pulling frigid outside air in through every gap, every floor crack, every door joint, hard enough that candle flames bent toward the walls on still nights, the stove eating the heat it made as fast as it made it. Ingrid's solution was a buried pipe. She'd found a section of 2-inch wrought iron pipe in Carl's lean-to, about 8 feet of it, the remnant of some plumbing project he'd meant to start and hadn't. She ran it underground from outside the cabin, entering through the crawl space beneath the floor, rising up through the floorboards to connect to the stove's ash door. The pipe was buried about 14 inches down, angling to rise about 6 inches per running foot, and she packed clay around the floor penetration. What that buried pipe does is give the stove a dedicated outside air supply it doesn't have to steal from the room. The combustion air comes in from outside and travels 14 inches underground, where the earth temperature, even in January, holds between 32 and 40 degrees. The air enters the firebox pre-warmed above freezing rather than at 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove burns more efficiently, and the negative pressure inside the cabin disappears because the stove is no longer competing with the room for air. Ingrid had spent the previous winter watching exactly what happened when she opened the ash door versus keeping it closed, had felt the draft change. I had noticed that the fire burned differently depending on how tight the door was, and had done the math of it without calling it math. Observing what she had, understanding what it meant, adjusting, Carl Halvorsen rode back out in early December, on a day when the temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit and a light wind was cutting across the prairie from the west. He stood inside the cabin while Ingrid poured him coffee. The stove had been burning since 6 in the morning on 6 logs. The interior temperature measured by the small thermometer on the wall Carl had nailed there the previous winter read 67 degrees Fahrenheit, and the candle on the table burned straight up with no draft. Halverson looked at the thermometer, looked at the wood situation, the pile next to the stove, which was modest, looked at the sealed floor joints and the pipe collar where the stovepipe met the roof, which Ingrid had packed with clay and then sealed with a tight-fitted metal flange she'd bent herself out of a tin can lid. He didn't say anything about any of it. He asked if she'd heard about the winter relief applications the county was taking. She said she had. And he rode back to town and told a man named Ellsworth Petter, who owned the hardware store and whose opinion carried weight in Kingsbury, that Ingrid Solberg had done something peculiar with her cabin, and he wasn't entirely sure she was going to freeze. Petter expressed doubt. The general consensus was that a young widow who'd spent 2 months working the creek mud when she should have been laying in provisions was going to have a hard January, and January 12th settled it. The morning of the 12th was what the whole territory remembered later as the treachery of it, the warmth. In Huron, people later said it felt like a March thaw, that specific quality of Dakota air when winter relaxes its grip for an afternoon and lets you believe it might be over. Farmers opened barn doors. Teachers let children leave their coats on the schoolhouse pegs. A wagon driver outside the feed store took off his hat because the sun felt good. Ingrid Solberg did not open her barn door. She did not hang washing. She'd been watching the sky since dawn, and the colour at the western horizon had a quality to it she had seen once before. As a child in Norway watching weather come in off the Trondheimsfjord, a stillness in the northwest that was not calm but arrested, like something holding its breath. She brought extra wood inside before 9 in the morning, put the horse in the lean-to and latched it, filled the water barrel and sealed the door. The front hit Kingsbury County sometime around 1 in the afternoon. She heard it before she saw it, a sustained deep note from the northwest, like nothing wind normally sounds like, more pressure than sound. And then the cabin walls flexed once with a single creak as the air pressure hit, and the temperature outside dropped so fast that condensation formed on the inside of her window glass and froze to frost in about 40 seconds. She built the fire up and sat down to wait. What happened in the cabins and claim shanties elsewhere in the county over the next 18 hours is what you would expect from structures sealed with canvas and stuffed prairie grass. The Engstrom family, half a mile north, ran out of wood by midnight and spent the final 6 hours of the blizzard huddled in every piece of clothing they owned, burning a rocking chair and 2 sections of flooring to stay alive. The Petter family in town proper, whose frame house sat on a brick foundation with no banking of earth around it, burned through their entire supply of coal by dawn, and the interior of their house hit 38 degrees Fahrenheit. In the Halverson place, on the west side of the county, the cabin Carl Halverson had described as good and tight, the chinking started failing around 2 in the morning. The clay he'd used was plain river mud without lime, applied the previous spring and not redone in fall. 18 hours of 27 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures and 60-mile winds pulled the dried mud away from the log faces in 4 sections. The family retreated to one corner of the room and built up the fire to the point the stovepipe glowed orange, and they survived. But Carl Halverson's wife lost 2 fingers to frostbite on her right hand before morning. At Ingrid Solberg's cabin, the wall thermometer read 58 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 in the morning. The stove had burned steadily through the night on a modest load of wood, the clay-lime chinking held everywhere, having by December fully carbonated into something close to soft limestone. The buried air pipe kept the fire burning efficiently without robbing the room's warmth. The sealed floor joints kept the cold from pooling at floor level, where 2 additional people were sleeping by then. Those 2 people were Lars and Britta Svensson, neighbours from the north, who'd left their own place. Sometime around midnight, after their stovepipes separated from the collar at the ceiling, a failure of the unfilled clay packing around the flange and the draft reversal began drawing cold air into the cabin faster than the fire could warm it. They'd wrapped themselves in everything they owned and walked 1.5 miles through a blizzard where you couldn't see your own hand at arm's length, and they'd walked toward Ingrid's place for a specific reason. They'd watched her work all October and November. Lars had ridden past the creek bank twice in October and seen her loading clay. He'd seen her at the north wall on her knees in near-freezing temperatures. He'd seen the finished wall face in early November and noticed the colour, that grey-white of lime wash, and thought it unusual but filed it away. He told Britta in November that the Norwegian widow across the creek had done something to her cabin he didn't fully understand, but that it looked unlike anything else in the county. And when their stovepipe failed and the cold came in and they had to decide which direction to walk, he walked toward Ingrid. She opened the door at what she estimated was 3 a.m. Lars Svensson's eyebrows were iced solid. Britta couldn't speak because her jaw was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together. Ingrid brought them to the stove and put water on for coffee, and they sat close enough to the iron that they could feel it radiate against their palms. And the cabin around them held at 58 degrees, while outside the mercury sat at -27 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind ran at 60 miles an hour. Here is what Ingrid Solberg understood about heat that most of her neighbours did not, and what the clay in her walls was actually doing. A wood stove, burning well, produces somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 BTUs per hour. And what that means in practical terms depends entirely on what happens to that heat after it leaves the firebox. In a drafty cabin with poor chinking, a significant portion goes directly out the gaps in the walls, not as radiated warmth into the room, but as heated air pushed out by pressure from the fire itself. The stove heats the air near it, the warm air rises, the gap at the top of the log joint lets it out, cold air comes in at the bottom to replace it, and you are running a cycle of heating and losing at rates that the stove can barely keep up with. Clay chinking, when it's properly done, breaks that cycle, not because clay is a good insulator on its own, since a 2-inch joint of packed clay gives you roughly R0, 5 to R1, which is not much, but because it cuts infiltration. The air exchange through the walls drops from 3 or 4 air changes per hour down to less than 1, and that change in infiltration is worth more to a frontier cabin's heat retention than any amount of additional wood. The lime clay mixture in Ingrid's walls did something beyond simply blocking gaps. Because dense, moist clay has a specific heat capacity, about 2 to 3 times that of dry wood, the walls of that cabin held heat the way a cast iron skillet holds heat slowly, absorbing warmth from the fire during the day and radiating it back slowly through the night. The clay, in a joint 8 feet long, 6 inches tall, and 2 inches deep, weighed somewhere around 40 or 50 pounds, and the total clay mass in all 4 walls of her cabin, plastered inside and out, weighed several hundred pounds. Those hundreds of pounds of lime clay had been absorbing the heat of her daily fires for 2 months before the blizzard hit, so that by January 12th the walls themselves were storing several thousand BTUs that released slowly through the night. This is why the temperature in that cabin did not crash when the fire burned low in the hours before dawn. The walls were working with the stove rather than against it. Cold air couldn't get in, and the stored warmth in the clay mass couldn't get out quickly. The building held its heat the way a stone-lined root cellar holds its coolness in summer, not by blocking the exchange, but by slowing it past the point where it matters. The buried air pipe was the other half of the equation. With combustion air coming in from outside, the stove wasn't pulling the cabin into negative pressure. No cold air was forced in through the walls to compensate for air going up the pipe, and the fire burned cleaner and hotter on less wood, because the pre-warmed outside air-ground temperature, even in January, held the buried pipe above freezing, supported more complete combustion. The difference in wood consumption between a properly ventilated stove and a room air stove in a Dakota winter ran between 20 and 30%, which is the difference between a woodpile that lasts to February and one that lasts to March. After the blizzard broke sometime in the early afternoon of January 13th, Ingrid walked to the Halvorson place and helped dress Carl Halvorson's wife's frostbitten hand. She brought her last jar of lard and wrapped the fingers in cloth strips she'd soaked in warm water and let cool to body temperature. She didn't say anything about the chinking, and Carl Halvorson didn't say anything about it either. She helped the Engstrom family locate the section of flooring they'd burned and gave them 4 lengths of the cottonwood she had left over from her chinking work to use as temporary floor fill. She stopped at 2 other claims on the way back and confirmed that everyone was alive. When spring came, 3 families in Kingsbury County asked Ingrid Solberg to help them re-chink their cabins. She showed them the lime mixture, showed them how to pack the willow sticks in first to give the clay something to key into, showed them the lime wash to run over the dried surface. She showed them the buried air pipe, and Lars Svensson put one in himself that summer. She didn't present it as something she'd invented, because she hadn't invented any of it. She presented it as what it was, the way her grandfather had plastered stone walls, the way the German-Russian families down in the southern counties had been building their thick-walled clay houses since the moment they arrived. Knowledge that had been in use for centuries in colder places than Dakota Territory, carried across the Atlantic in the heads of people who knew that winter was not a problem you solved with enough wood and that you solved it with walls. Ingrid Solberg proved up her claim in June of 1890, 3 years after Carl's death. The homestead file was recorded at the Yankton Land Office. She later sold the eastern 40 acres to Lars Svensson and kept the remainder, adding a second room to the cabin the following summer: log walls, clay lime chinking, a second stove with its own buried air pipe, and she was still on the land in 1900. Her name does not appear in most histories of the Dakota Territory, winter of 1887, 1888. Neither do the names of most of the women who proved up their claims alone. The 20 or 25% of homesteaders who were single women, widowed women, divorced women, and who survived not because the frontier was kind to them, but because they made careful decisions in the fall, before the cold came, when there was still time to do the work right. The children's blizzard killed 235 people, and historians and weather researchers who have gone back through the records since have found that the primary cause of death in almost every case was not the severity of the storm itself. The primary cause was exposure during transit, people caught in the open, or structural failure of buildings that were not adequately sealed. Most of the deaths happened within a mile or 2 of shelter. The storm was 18 hours long, and the people who were inside well-sealed, well-fueled buildings when the front hit at 1 in the afternoon did not die. The warm morning was the trap, and the sealed cabin was the only reliable answer, and the sealed cabin required work done in October, in the cold, at the creek bank, with clay-stained hands, in conditions that looked to the people watching from the road like a foolish woman doing something unnecessary when she should have been doing something sensible. The Thermal Wall Survey, the Nebraska State Historical Society, conducted on surviving sod and log structures from the 1880s, found that the buildings in the best condition structurally and thermally were almost universally the ones where earth and chinking had been applied in multiple layers with lime admixture and maintained annually. The ones that failed catastrophically in the winters of 1886-88 were the ones sealed with organic materials alone: grass, moss, rags that compressed, deteriorated, and opened gaps as the logs settled. Dense earthen mass in building walls is not an antiquated idea that people eventually replaced with something better. Rammed earth and adobe construction are used in contemporary passive house building specifically because the thermal mass properties, the ability to absorb daytime heat and release it slowly at night, reduce mechanical heating loads by 30 to 50% in cold climates. The principle hasn't changed since the Mandans sealed their earth lodges on the Knife River. What changed is that successive waves of settlers arrived in Dakota Territory without knowing it, tried to build the way they'd built in places where winter was merely cold rather than lethal, and learned the difference the hard way. Ingrid Solberg did not learn it the hard way. She learned it from watching her grandfather's hands move over a stone wall in Trondheim before she was old enough to understand what she was seeing. She learned it from spending a winter in a poorly sealed cabin and paying attention to exactly what was failing and why. She learned it from the clay in the creek bank that she noticed in the spring of 1886 and filed away for a use she didn't yet know she'd need. She walked down to that creek in October of 1887, 3 weeks after they put Carl in the ground, and started pulling clay out of the bank in near-freezing temperatures. The town watched her do it and shook their heads. 3 months later, at 3 a.m, with the temperature outside at 27 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 of those people were sitting in front of her stove, and the stove burned all night on less than a quarter cord of wood. And the thermometer on the wall read 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the candle on the table burned straight up.